Okay, so democracy at work, cooperation in civil society, alternatives to state socialism. I'm going to be slightly provocative there and put a damp squib on some people, I suppose. Well, I'm coming at this as a historian, and obviously if we're going to talk about cooperation, we're talking about over 200 years of history, so it's not a new idea, and we need to understand what happened before and what went wrong before. And why cooperation hasn't become a more important part of modern society. And I suppose start with a little bit of a sort of empirical thing. I've just written an article called Experiments in Industrial Democracy, which is actually a study of the Leicester boot and shoe cooperatives. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but Leicester's got a particularly strong cooperative tradition. And particularly a strong tradition of worker cooperatives or producer cooperatives. So whereas the mainstream cooperative movement in Britain from the late 19th century onwards was dominated by consumer cooperation, Leicester was the main centre for producer cooperation within that movement, albeit a much smaller part of the movement. So it's a major centre. Leicester, a centre of cooperative co-partnership is the term that people used at the time. And this is a movement in a sense that starts in the late 19th century and goes up, it carries on till fairly recently, but its heyday is up until, up until the 1970s. So it's the worker cooperative movement that precedes the 1970s type cooperative movement, which comes from a different source. It's interesting because it's got like a stakeholder type model. It's not a pure worker cooperative movement. They are worker run, but the consumer societies have shares in them. Some other individuals have shares in them. But they are, by and large, worker-dominated societies. The biggest and best known, which closed as late as 2009, was Equity in central Leicester. The first and the last of this group of cooperatives, employed at 1,400 workers, so quite substantial, and its factory is still there. I think students now live in the factory. Another interesting one was called self-help, which tells you quite a lot about the ethos of this movement, which was actually started by the National Union of Boot and Shoe Operatives. So the trade unions in the late 19th century were very interested in these producer cooperatives and were a major force behind starting them. And perhaps the most interesting one is the Anchor Cooperative, which in addition to starting a worker cooperative, also created a small garden suburb outside Leicester, which you can still visit. As part of that sort of garden city type idea at the start of the 20th century. It's an interesting movement, I think, because I think very few people seem to know about it. It has, despite the fact that the mainstream consumer cooperative movement turned its back on producer cooperatives at the start of the 20th century, this movement retained, particularly in Leicester, quite good relationships with the consumer cooperative movement. And so it had quite a lot of institutional support. It sold a lot of its boot and shoes to consumer cooperatives, for instance. And despite the hostility of people like Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who said that basically cooperatives would either fail as businesses or as democracies. And that's an idea that I think has been very popular on the left ever since. So many left-wing people are actually hostile to cooperatives because they think that they'll compromise in one way or another. And I think the evidence from my article is that this wasn't true. These cooperatives were pretty successful on a fairly small scale over quite a long period of time. I think if you're looking for the ideology, where the ideas come from, they're inspired by late 19th century radical liberal ideas. So there's already in the late 19th century, there's a debate going on between state socialist type ideas and radical liberal ideas. And when I say radical liberal, some of these people would have called themselves socialists. They would have been in the ILP, they would have been ethical socialists, but they weren't Marxist socialists, if you like. And they were interested in sort of voluntary alternatives, and this always seems to be a very important theme in the history of both consumer and producer cooperatives, the idea of voluntary alternatives to state socialism. Linking this to another thing I've just been doing at the moment is that my argument really, that the controversial bit, is that neoliberalism isn't the only problem for co-ops and civil society. A lot of the ideas and traditions of the left are actually very hostile to co-ops and to civil society. And I think we have to address those problems. And in our new book, we've got a chapter on the Cooperative Party, and the way in which that project of the Cooperative Party to create a voluntary cooperative commonwealth was sidelined and marginalised by the mainstream forces in the Labour Party in Britain. And I think there's a fundamental problem here with what we call state socialism. And Michael Young, who also features in our book, the guy who wrote the Labour Party manifesto in 1945, started the Open University, etc., etc. Michael Young characterises this as a tension between equality and fellowship, and that the large parts of the sort of middle class social engineering part of the labour movement are obsessed with equality from above, and they're not so interested in fellowship, if you like. And in a sense, cooperatives bring home that fellowship aspect. And so people like the Webbs tend to prefer big state solutions, you know, the National Health Service, the nationalisation of industries, council housing. And these impinged on, in my article, these impinged on the experience of these worker cooperatives. So for instance, the Humber's and Garden suburb had large parts of their land compulsory purchased by the local authority when they were building council houses. And there was this sort of disrespect for this sort of voluntary type approach to cooperation. And of course and what happened was that the trend in the 20th century was to marginalise both consumer and producer cooperation in the labour movement. And obviously we can't talk about these things without talking about communism or actually existing socialism all over the world, which basically absorbed cooperative movements into the state, along with other civil society institutions like trade unions. So destroyed their voluntarism, destroyed their independence. And there's a really excellent book on by Applebaum about the Iron Curtain in the 1940s, 1950s Eastern Europe, which shows the process by which the Communist parties just take over all these voluntary associations and turn them into state conveyor belts. And that's true of the cooperative movement. So I think that there's a problem with the mainstream left in relation to cooperation and civil society, because they retain a very, what I would call an instrumental, provisional attitude to civil society. So in one sense, if you look at, say, the British Communist Party, they were terrific as civil society actors. They were out there organising things all the time. But they were only doing that so they could close down civil society when they got into power. And so that's the problem I think we have to deal with a little bit in relation to this. I think my argument would be that the cooperatives are still relevant if we think of them as not as a big cooperative commonwealth that solves all the problems, but as little utopias, as parts of civil society. One of the features of the ones I looked at was that they were mainly started by skilled working class men. And they were started in the late 19th century, mainly because they didn't like mechanisation. They wanted to carry on making shoes in their sort of craft sort of way, although eventually they had to sort of give ground to that. And so in a sense, they're kind of self-selecting organisations. You know, they wouldn't work for everybody. They work for people that want to work in a different way. But I'm not convinced that everybody wants to work in a different way. Lots of people like just to go to work and get paid, go home and forget about it. You know? So I think that in that sense, I would think of them as little utopias and part of building a civil society between the state and the market. And I take Martin's point that civil society between the state and the market also takes in employment as well, the employment sector as well. So I think in a sense that the big society is a good idea, however flawed its application. So the idea of a big society, the idea of not just focusing on using the state to solve all our problems is a good idea. And I accept that neoliberals can corrode civil society. You know, the privatisation of mutuals in the early 1980s and stuff would be an example of where an important part of civil society was lost to us. And there was recent threat to sort of privatised housing associations, wasn't there, that sort of thing. So there is a threat from neoliberalism. But I would want to argue that markets are not the enemy, because markets, in some sense or other, are absolutely central to voluntarism and essential to the freedom of the cooperative movement. In the same way as a lot of people who are strong supporters of trade unions rail against markets, but without markets there are no free trade unions. Free trade unions have never existed without markets. And I think we have to recognise that and think carefully about how markets can work in relation to things like cooperatives and trade unions. In terms of social democracy, I think social democracies tended to have a divided mind on civil society. So there's been one strand in social democracy, the sort of Sydney and Beatrice Webb strand, which is all about getting hold of the state, using the state to create big state patterns on society. And I think that's still very popular. When I hear people saying, oh, we've got to go back and renationalise the railways, well, there might be a case for renationalising the railways, but it's a kind of worrying sort of ideology, the idea that the only way to deal with problems is to use the state in that sort of big way. And one of the things we argue about in the book is that the importance of a rather different tradition that runs through 20th century Britain, and we've got quite a few representative figures from that. Quite a wide range of people, from ranging from right-wing Labour to sort of anarchists. We've got Hilary Wainwright in there. We've got Stuart Hall in there. We've got GDH Cole in there. We've got Michael Young in there. A whole group of people across the political spectrum that we characterise as liberal pluralists. People who want to see a solution to some of the social problems in society, but don't want to use the big state to impose it on society. And I'll stop there.